So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Chinese Diaspora, Challenges and Possibilities in a Time of Uncertainty. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Operations Coordinator for the Zoryan Institute, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. This webinar is hosted by the Institute for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, a division of the Zoryan Institute, the UCLA Asia Pacific Center, and the UC Berkeley Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program. Founded in 1982, the Zoryan Institute is a nonprofit organization that serves the cause of scholarship and public awareness relating to issues of universal human rights, genocide, and diaspora homeland relations. Since 1991, the Institute has been publishing Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, a formative journal that focuses on the multidisciplinary study of the history, culture, social structure, politics, and economics of diasporas. Through its work, the Institute recognizes that diasporic communities share a number of characteristics, that each diaspora has its own unique story to tell. It is in this context that Zoryan Institute has launched the Diaspora Collection, a series of publications focused on individual diasporic communities. The first book of this collection is The Chinese Diaspora, Its Development in Global Perspective. It features an original introduction by Professor Lok Su of UC Berkeley and papers that span over 3 decades of scholarly research on the Chinese diaspora. The collection focuses on 3 overarching areas that both shape and are shaped by the diaspora: culture, entrepreneurship, and migration, and highlights the heterogeneity of the Chinese diasporic communities in historical context, as well as their relationships with the homeland and adopted nation states. For more information on this book and how to purchase a copy, or to learn more about the work of the Zoryan Institute, my colleagues will be posting a few links in the chat box throughout this webinar. Today, we are very fortunate to have 3 very prominent scholars in the field who will be touching on subjects ranging from the challenges of US-China geopolitical competition to the impact of COVID-19 on Chinese Canadians. Please submit your questions in the Q&A section throughout the webinar, and if your question is directed to a specific speaker, please specify. We will have a chance to answer these questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first panelist for today's webinar, Professor Lok Su. Professor Lok Su is a cultural anthropologist and associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of California at Berkeley. She is also the program coordinator of the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program. She is an academic board member of the Zoryan Institute and the co-editor of the Institute's new publication, The Chinese Diaspora, Its Development in Global Perspective. Her research interests include diaspora, transnationalism, cultural citizenship and unbelonging, cultural politics of food, race-gender formation, Asians in the Americas, and Chinese diaspora. Lok Su, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that very wonderful introduction. I do have slides to share, and I will try to go ahead and get that up right now. But meanwhile, is that showing up by any chance?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, I should be able to go into screen share. Yes. Okay, there.
Perfect.
Great. There you go. So I thought I would go ahead and start the conversation with probably one of the most pressing issues of our time at the moment, which is around anti-Asian, anti-Chinese violence in the time of our pandemic. We are, of course, facing multiple issues that are causing this rise of anti-Asian violence. The pandemic, there is the trade war that is occurring between the US and China, which has had ripple effects throughout the world. That trade war and comprises, on a war around technology, a war around science and intellectual property, and all other kinds of various aspects around for Chinese diaspora. So let me, with no further ado, let me go ahead and talk about the anti-Asian violence, primarily focusing in the U.S., but I think we will see there are implications for the Chinese diaspora throughout the world. So I think that since March 2020 to now, there's been a heightened uptake in anti-Chinese, anti-Asian American hate incident cases. In a 3-month period, you can see that there are 2,100 hate cases that were reported. 40 of them happen to be in California, which is surprising given the large size of Asian Americans in California. If we look at the Human Rights Watch, we also see that similar incidents are occurring all over the world. And in particular, you know, with similar to our case in the US, you know, where our own president, we're actually using the terms such as the Chinese virus or the Kung flu, we're seeing that the effects of those racial slurs are actually causing much of this rise in anti-Chinese and anti-Asian aggressions all over the US and throughout the world. And we see this replicated by politicians all over the world. You see here, you know, a statement by the governor of the Veneto area in region of Italy, who are, you know, saying that the Chinese are eating asserting that Chinese are eating mice alive. You have Brazilian education minister who are ridiculing Chinese people. So you see these incidents, you know, where high-level leadership, you know, in national politics are actually making fun or using racial slurs against the Chinese. What we have here is really a caption of of the number of cases that are happening all over the world. In the UK, you know, we have 267 anti-Asian hate crimes that are reported just between a 2-month period of January to March. In Russia, you also had the police, the Moscow trans, really stopping Chinese in the public transport system and asking them for the documentations. In Australia, you know, you have people who are committing these crimes, meanwhile saying these horrible things, go back to China, excuse my language, you fucking immigrants, you know, death to dog-eating Chinese, and COVID-19 China die, etc. And then, of course, you have in Spain, you have other incidents. So these are just a very abbreviated versions to give you the scope of the violence that is happening, you know, in among the Chinese diaspora and Asians in the U.S. and other places. So how do we make sense of this recent rise? What do we contribute to the rise of violence? I think there are two strands that I want to look at. One is on the ideological front, which is around the idea of yellow peril and the persistence of it. The other aspect that I think we need to consider is the current geopolitical context, meaning primarily the China-US economic competition that is creating a context and the conditions for this kind of uptick in violence. So first, in regards to the ideology of yellow peril, and this is more, it's an ideology, so it's transhistorical, right? In a sense that the very early kind of manifestation of yellow peril began in the late 19th century, where the European and US powers were beginning to witness a rise in Asia. You know, first in China, then in Japan, and you see in this picture, you know, captured here, the image of the archangel referring to the rising Buddha to the east, and saying that this is a threat, you know, a potential threat to Europe and the US, to the West. You know, this is also in the late 1900s in the US, you also had a rise of anti-Chinese sentiments. You know, you see these images, these recurring images of portraying Chinese as, you know, deviant, as criminal, as dangerous, and as well as, you know, opium smokers, people who were engaged in gambling, etc. You know, so these images were circulating in order to sort of produce these sentiments of yellow peril and fear. Similar to the current moment of the pandemic, you know, in the 1870s with disease outbreaks, there were also a blame of Chinatown as well as a center for generating and producing the viruses and the disease. And you will see here, you know, in the sources that leprosy, smallpox, malaria were all sort of diseases that were tied to Chinese and Chinatown. Chinese Americans in Chinatown. So this was a scapegoating of the Chinese during this height of anti-Chinese sentiment. This period coincided, of course, with the labor competition that the Chinese posed to the American public, in a sense that it was at the end of the railroad construction that you had an outpour of these laborers going into central area cities, you know, to find other kinds of labor. And this is the period when you had a heightened, you know, Chinese, anti-Chinese based on economic competition. And here's just another image to show the kind of treatment of the Chinese being sort of kicked out, you know, because of their economic competition. This, you know, all this, the disease of the late 1800s, the labor competition, all that sort of culminated into riots all over the U.S. And again, this is just a list of anti-Chinese violence. In addition to this, there were also violence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and elsewhere as well. So I didn't include that here, but I just want to mention that. All this is, you know, all that culminated in many ways the legislation of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1875, the Page Act, and the Exclusion Acts of 1882. Afterwards, you know, you also have this continuation and perpetuation of the yellow peril ideology through popular culture and novels such as, you know, here the images of Fu Manchu, and they're still very much sort of within the American psyche, and I would say Western psyche more generally. But you know, this is I don't want to confine our conversation only within, you know, this sort of ideology of yellow peril, because I think the current moment has a lot to do with this uptick. You know, and I think that had I been speaking with you 2 years ago, we would have a very different conversation, you know, about, I'm thinking about Crazy Rich Asians, you know, this is a very different portrayal, a moment of Chineseness, what it means to be Chinese, you know, in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere in the world. Right now, we're in a crisis, you know, since I will say, you know, 2018, probably a little bit before that, but the intensification of that beginning in 2018 around the US-China economic competition, which manifests in both the trade tariffs, in the intellectual scientific property, and also in techno-economic warfare. I want to turn to our attention around this particular moment. You know, we see in 2018 onward, you know, a heightened awareness and accusations against Chinese American scientists. And here you have the NIH and the FBI working together to investigate at least 180 scientists and more than 65 institutions. Most were ethnic Chinese scientists. 82% of those were being investigated, were of Chinese descent. And universities, you know, all over the US have risen up to speak against the racial profiling of Asian Americans, but, you know, but it still remains the case that many of the Chinese Americans are really anxious about this potential for arrests, you know, and accusations of espionage. We can, you know, remind ourselves of the case of Dr. Wen-Ho Lee, you know, who was falsely accused of espionage as well in the U.S. And that case was solved. He was acquitted. You know, there was nothing that tied him to any wrongdoing. And again, you know, we see this manifested in this creation of fear, you know, around Chinese espionage, but this time around fear of the scientists, you know, and intellectuals of our society. FBI Director Christopher Wray has been very upfront with his statements, you know, to a number of security agencies. He's given a lot of speeches everywhere, you know, about China, you know, what he has termed sort of the whole of society approach, in which, you know, he's quoted here saying China has pioneered a societal approach to stealing innovation in any way it can from a wide array of businesses, universities, and organizations. Put simply, China seems determined to steal its way up the economic ladder at our expense. So this is the kind of messaging, you know, that our government, you know, the FBI, in fact, is sort of propagating. And this has induced a lot of fear into not only universities, but businesses and organizations, you know, around, you know, who can be spying, you know, what is this, what does this mean by the whole of society, that anyone who is of Chinese descent is suspect of a potential sort of engagement in espionage. You also have the current condition of the cybersecurity war, you know, that is going on, which is tied to the techno-economic warfare, and we see, you know, recently in the case of Huawei being seen and targeted as an economic threat. And I have to say that, you know, this is one of the highest profile first cases that a transnational company that's charged with trade secret theft, sanctions violation, and federal racketeering. We know that Huawei has posed a tremendous economic competition to the US companies, especially in the tech area. I mean, it's incredible that in 10 years, the company has risen to a point where, you know, it has become more of a household name than other companies like Ericsson and Motorola and companies like that used to have that role. And we see that Huawei is under, you know, tremendous attack. We also recently heard about the TikTok phenomenon. You know, we have 100 million US users. And again, you know, this company in particular has been targeted, you know, as the one to blame for a number of things, you know, for potential espionage once again, and issues of stealing data, you know, from the US, of trade secrets and things like that. And along with that, we also have the case of WeChat. I just want to point out that TikTok was particularly of interest, you know, for our president, just because it was the same platform that was used to skew the numbers of attendance at the Tulsa, Oklahoma rally, in which, you know, the arena was left half empty. So he really went after TikTok, you know, tremendously for that. And again, we see WeChat as another space, you know, that is again targeted by our officials, by our president to crack down on. So what we're seeing here is this consolidation of anti-Chinese discourse that is brought together, you know, by the coronavirus, the pandemic, you know, and also the science and research arena, where you have a racial profiling of Asian American scientists, and you also have the technology and media companies that are coming under attack. All this sort of formulate, you know, the conditions, the context for an uptick, you know, for Chinese American and diasporic Chinese violence. So what are the challenges, you know, that are going to be for diasporic Chinese? On the one hand, I think this geopolitical relations between U.S. and China, and China relations with other European countries will become a huge place, a platform for kind of figuring out whether it's going to be a relationship of collaboration or competition. And that is going to have an effect, you know, on diasporic Chinese and the way that they're treated and seen. The other thing is, you know, how are Chinese or Asian Americans asserting themselves or seeing themselves in relationship to national belonging, right? And here we have to make a case of, you know, we've often been seen as foreigners, you know, as perpetual foreigners, regardless of how many generations that we have been residing in these countries. And, you know, again, this is the time where we need to assert and make clear that we do belong, you know, in these countries as diasporic Chinese, but living in as citizens of these countries. And we need to make that case politically, socially, and culturally. So I just want to wrap that up, and I'll turn it back to Megan.
Thank you very much for that. Okay. It's time to announce our next panelist. Professor Chris Lee is an associate professor of English, director of the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program, and associate principal of St. John's College at the University of British Columbia. He's the author of The Semblance of Identity, Aesthetic Mediation in Asian American Literature, which received the Literary Criticism Book Award from the Association for Asian American Studies. His research focuses on the diaspora Chinese literary thought during the Cold War and the cultural politics of Chinese Canadian historical narratives. Professor Lee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen too. Okay.
Right. Just making you the...
Okay, let's see this works.
You should have the ability now.
Okay. Okay, let's try this. Okay, thank you. So let me first mention I'm speaking this afternoon from Vancouver, which is located on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And I also want to respectfully acknowledge the many Indigenous lands that are represented in this webinar, this transnational webinar today. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Thanks very much to Locke for inviting me to be here. And of course, congratulations to you and your team for publishing this book. Mine arrived a couple of days ago in the mail. It's kind of blurring out in my Zoom background, but it was actually really good to see so many essays in this collection that were so intellectually formative for me as a graduate student, and then later on as a junior academic, just to see it all collected here for this conversation. And as I was reviewing Locke's intro, she began by talking about the conceptual challenge of the Chinese diaspora as something to grasp. And, with the tremendous diversity of the Chinese diaspora, the spatial spread, the historical diversity, and the many paths of migration that create the Chinese diaspora, how do we understand the Chinese diaspora has always been a big and pressing challenge. And it is just as much so during time of COVID. And so I want to just use my brief time today to talk a little bit about COVID, racism, and community in the Chinese Canadian context, to outline a few of the developments and to may hopefully then bring in a few themes from Locke's intro that we can use to maybe begin to unravel this current moment that we're in. One thing I want to mention as a way of starting is that when COVID really hit Canada in February, March of this year, it was coming after months and maybe even years of heightened tension among Chinese Canadian communities as well as among different communities in Canada. And so one example, for example, would be the Hong Kong protests, especially during the height of the Hong Kong protests last year. There was a fair amount of tension amongst different ethnic Chinese Canadian communities. Another example coming off Locke's discussion is the ongoing detainment of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, which is a case that's unfolding in Vancouver as we speak. And these two kind of examples are really part of this much longer multi-year process of contending with capital immigration and its effect on a place like Vancouver. I should mention Vancouver is about 28% ethnic Chinese from very different, Chinese-speaking societies, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland, and everywhere else in the Chinese diaspora. So population-wise, I think developments in the Chinese-speaking world have an incredible impact on Vancouver as a city, and even more so in some of the suburbs. And the kind of xenophobia that Locke was talking about has also been, in the ether of this area over the last couple of years. This is a poster of Crazy Rich Asians, the movie. They got defaced in a Vancouver neighborhood. And you can just see that the kind of stereotypes that link Asians and particularly Chinese to capital are indeed alive and well and have been for many decades. So this is the larger context in which this has happened. And it seems to be important to mention that these tensions really reflect a systematic exclusion of Chinese Canadians across multiple institutions and social sectors in Canada. So ranging from education to media to policy to politics, leadership. And so at times of heightened tension, we find our institutions with less capacity to understand, let alone address the challenges of racism and racial differences in nuanced ways. And because of the diversity of the Chinese community, that nuance is absolutely crucial. And so when the COVID-19 hit earlier this spring, these same institutions were caught unprepared for the dramatic escalation of anti-Asian racism. And of course, this comes after the heels of of widespread coverage of the origins of COVID-19, coverage of anti-Chinese rhetoric, especially in US politics. And even though epidemiological studies since then have shown that most strains of COVID in BC are actually traceable to the US or Europe, and very few directly from Asia, that sort of stigma of COVID continues to last in its relationship to Chinese-speaking diasporas. And so we were seeing in the spring a marked increase of anti-Asian racism, physical attacks. This particular attack, elderly Chinese man in a store in East Vancouver where I live was brutally attacked by this gentleman who is caught on a security camera. And this was really, I think, the story in many ways that broke through media coverage, just noting the vulnerability of our elders in terms of being attacked in their daily routines. We were also seeing a heightened increase of verbal abuse, certainly hearing this from friends and family members. And again, just to mention that, this targeting was not only happening to Chinese. Of course, in the racial category of Asian, people who look Asian were being targeted for COVID racism. And in fact, there are also cases across Canada of Indigenous peoples being attacked for COVID racism. And so this is a broader racial question around peoples of color during the pandemic. We also saw defacing of property related to the Chinese community. These are lions that are held at sort of the gateway to Vancouver's Chinatown. They were repeatedly defaced over the summer, and other property in Chinatown was defaced as well with clearly racist undertones and graffiti. And then the overall context of just increased coverage of racism in the media. So we had sort of very banal examples such as Bryan Adams' infamous attack on wet markets, to far more weaponized versions. So for example, the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, Dr. Theresa Tam, who immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong many years ago, was attacked by a Conservative member of Parliament for spreading Chinese propaganda. And so there's a lot more to talk about, but really we were looking at a dramatic increase of incidents throughout March and April targeting Chinese, Asians, and peoples of color. And then, of course, in May and June, this really became covered by media, both mainstream as well as community-based media. And I would say that the coverage has probably dropped back a little bit since then. But even as the coverage has waned considerably, it's become clear that a lot of the effects of this experience are long-lasting and they're continuing. And so for one thing, COVID racism is really exposing the kinds of racialized vulnerability that exists in Canada among different institutions. So amongst healthcare, for example, long-term care in industries like agriculture, food processing, and other sectors, peoples of color are affected in particular ways due to the economic situation of COVID. Many issues during this crisis have been around language barriers and institutional barriers. So especially when it comes to elders and immigrants, there are numerous barriers to accessing critical information about public health, accessing social services, and also accessing various kinds of government assistance and relief that are available during this time. And so I'll just give you one example. A lot of the community work around this in recent months has been to push the government to collect disaggregated data in terms of racialized communities and around gender and other categories. And surprisingly, this was not actually done across by a lot of institutions in Canada beforehand. And so this came out of a lot of consultation as well as a lot of activism by communities for governments to collect disaggregated data. And so for example, in the summer, Statistics Canada finally released data around unemployment. And so you can see, for example, here, Chinese at 14% is higher than the national average, and other groups of color are also higher as well. So this is just to have this data available has been really important, and to do it in responsible and ethical ways has been an important aspect of the current responses to COVID racism. So I should mention that in June, a survey came out from Angus Institute, which for those of you who are Canadian will know is probably our most reputable pollster, surveying experience of racism by Chinese Canadians. This is the headline of the article when it came out. And the numbers are quite noticeable and they're stark. And so you can see, for example, people treated with less respect, 60+% of respondents responded to that. Called names and insulted, there, another 50%. Personally threatened or intimidated, also 40-some-odd% reported that experience. The one that a finding that I thought was very sobering was 61% report adjusting their routines to avoid run-ins or otherwise unpleasant encounters since the outbreak began. And just sort of anecdotally within my own family and within people that I know, I mean, this was and continues to be a daily reality in terms of being careful about our daily lives in order to avoid potential racist outbreaks. So if you think about the effects on the daily lives of Chinese Canadians, this has been quite substantial, not to say about the long-term institutional as well as economic effects of that. So let me just maybe by way of conclusion, I want to just mark out 3 kind of questions or themes that I've been thinking about, and I think are also kind of interesting questions more broadly for studies of Chinese diaspora during this time. One is to think about Chinese diaspora communities as sources of knowledge and social capacity. And this is especially the case in areas of Vancouver that have high concentrations of Chinese residents, especially those who are connected with the larger Asia-Pacific world. The awareness of the epidemic came much earlier. I mean, people were just connected with family and friends in Asia who were experiencing the epidemic. And of course, for many, there's still a visceral memory of the SARS crisis from 2003. And so it was palpable that in many Chinese Canadian communities, masks and social distancing was practiced much more consistently and much earlier than in many other places. And there's some evidence that this has also led to better outcomes in terms of preventing spread and whatnot, even though a lot of COVID racism has actually been directed towards Asians for either wearing or not wearing masks. So in fact, this kind of response to COVID has actually been a source of social capacity when it comes to dealing with the epidemic. And I think this is really a broader way of thinking about how Chinese diaspora communities are in fact sources of knowledge and crucial knowledge as Canada's relationship to the Asia Pacific only gets more and more complex and more wide-reaching. So many of the issues that Locke talked about have resonance in Canada, and to keep emphasizing the Chinese diaspora communities, which are diverse and which have very different political commitments, have different ideological backgrounds and economic backgrounds, that these communities should be seen as sources of knowledge rather than scapegoated as the problem. And that's an institutional as well as a social issue to think about. A second point I want to mention, and this is just to steal a point from Locke's intro, actually, where she writes, new migrations and diversities can produce divisions, tensions, and conflicts, but they can also inspire new forms of belonging and new imaginaries of community. So I'm really inspired by the many grassroots efforts that have been taking place during this time to address systemic racism, often as sort of immediate solutions and responses to institutional neglect. So this is not necessarily a good situation to be in, but the energy has been incredibly inspiring. I'll just mention 2 projects that I've seen a lot of. The one on your left is Project 1907, which is a grassroots effort by activists, especially in Vancouver and Toronto, to have ways of reporting anti-Asian, anti-Chinese hate incidents. This is a graphic produced in September, and you can see here, I think they had some 600 plus incidents reported across Canada, mostly in Toronto and Vancouver, and you can see a little bit of the breakdown of how these incidents were experienced and in what places. So I think that work has been absolutely crucial in terms of stepping into a context where a lot of mainstream institutions were not collecting this information or responding to it adequately. The one on your right is C19help.ca, which is a coalition of groups in Vancouver working across Chinese, Vietnamese, and Tagalog speaking communities to translate information about health, but especially about government services, which is somewhat uneven when it comes to translation. So just want to mention these 2. There are many others I can mention, media campaigns and groups, but just to mark the flowering of imagination and activism that's happening at this time. And then just to end with something that Locke also mentioned, which is at this historical juncture, the racialization of Chinese diaspora, of diasporic Chinese, has shifted once again. And I think just reading that, I don't know whether you wrote this during COVID or before COVID, but it's just more true than ever. And I think especially in the context of a broader reckoning with racism, and broader reckoning with anti-Blackness, with ongoing effects of settler colonialism, indigenous peoples, that question of how are Chinese Canadians racialized both in Canada, but as well as in the Pacific region and in relation to the global diaspora, is an ongoing challenge for research as well as for community work. So I will stop here, thank you, and I look forward to Min's talk.
Thank you very much. Okay, and our third and final panelist today, Professor Min Zhou, Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies, the Walter and Shirley Wang Endowed Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications, and Director of the Asia Pacific Center at UCLA. Professor Zhou's main research areas are in migration and development, urban sociology, race and ethnicity, education and the new second generation, ethnic system of supplementary education, ethnic entrepreneurship, Chinese diaspora, and the sociology of Asia and Asian America. And she's published very widely in these areas. So Professor Zhou, it's a pleasure having you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Good evening. Tonight's event is to launch the Zoryan Institute's latest publication, The Chinese Diaspora and its Development in Global Perspective. I very much appreciate the Zoryan Institute and UC Berkeley's Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies for reaching out to our center, the UCLA Asia Pacific Center, for co-sponsoring this book launch event. And congratulations for the publisher, Zoryan Institute, and this book's co-editor, Professor Su. And I enjoyed Professor Su and Professor Lee's insightful remarks. I'm also honored to be included in this volume, and I have a chapter 9, entitled Changing Generational Dynamics in Chinese America Across Time, in which I focus on intra-diaspora dynamics in generational formation among different cohorts of Chinese immigrants in the US. So this evening, I would like to offer a few remarks on how US-China geopolitical competition has impacted Chinese immigration, especially skilled migration and immigrant integration at the present moment. The United States has established itself as a dominant economic and military power after World War II. During World War II, it was China's ally and provided tremendous support for China winning the war against the Japanese. But disappointingly, the Chinese nationalists lost the Civil War, and China turned communist and established itself as the People's Republic of China in 1949. After 1979, when the United States and China normalized diplomatic relations, the two countries have been friends and enemies. The US support China's economic reform while simultaneously perceive China as an imagined or real threat to the US hegemony. When communist China was isolated from the outside world and caught in internal power struggles and economic distress in the first 3 decades of its founding, the US has already maintained and consolidated its dominant power position as the world leader. At its rise in the current years as a result of successful economic reform, China has aspired to become a world leader and has gained confidence in challenging the US hegemony. Even before COVID-19, the two countries have shifted gear to engage in confrontational and strenuous relations. On the China side, China's territorial claim in the South China Sea, the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative, and its aggressive effort in recruiting talent from the US through the 1,000 Talent Program are some of the main causes for US concern. On the US side, trade disputes, especially pertaining to China's violation of the WTO agreement on the licensing of intellectual property rights, intensifying espionage offensive, and recently the tightening of policies regarding visas issued to visiting scholars and students from China, as well as the current mouth war over the source of COVID-19, are central to US-China tension. At the present moment, the bilateral relations are at the worst time, and COVID-19 makes it worse. The impacts on Chinese diaspora in the US are profound. Here, I want to focus on discussing how worsening US-China relations affect Chinese immigration, especially skill migration, and the implications for immigrant integration. Chinese emigration is centuries old. Mass emigration from China to the US dates back to the mid-19th century. Earlier Chinese immigrants were predominantly low-skilled labor from rural areas in Guangdong province in South China. Contemporary emigration from China took off after China opened door for economic reform in 1979. China since then has become one of the largest source countries of international migrants, largely due to rapid economic development, relaxed immigration policy, and policies promoting academic and student exchange. Contemporary Chinese immigrants to the US are vastly diverse in places of origin. They hail from all over China rather than from Guangdong province in South China. They also hail from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds where both low-skilled labor and highly skilled professionals are numerous. Since 2000, however, low-skilled labor emigration from China has slowed down and highly skilled professional migration has increased rapidly to outnumber low-skilled flows. So this is a figure shows the trend of Chinese immigration to the US from 1960 to 2018 at an annual average of more than 60,000 since 2000 with no signs of declining. More remarkably is the increasing flows of resourceful Chinese immigrants to the US. Economic reform in China gave rise to a wealthy elite and a growing middle class seeking emigration for a better life, as well as an insurance policy. The resourceful Chinese immigration is from two main sources. One is through student migration, and the other through the migration of investors and entrepreneurs taking advantage of the US EB-5 visa provision. So here is a figure shows that China takes the absolute lion's share of EB-5 visas. More than 3/4 of EB-5 visas went to the Chinese in the 2010s. The United States has been considered by the Chinese the most preferred destination for resettlement. For Chinese international students, the US is also the #1 preferred destination. Other preferred destinations include Canada, Australia, the UK, Japan, and Singapore. Chinese skill migration is primarily a student-turned-migrant phenomenon. Since 2008, China has been consistently the #1 source country for international students in the US. For example, in 2015-16, the number of Chinese students reached a record high of nearly 329,000, comprising a third of all international students in the US. So here is the chart showing that the trend of US student visas issued by national origin from 1997 to 2018. Chinese students, as you see, has been on top since 2008, peaked in 2016, and then dropped significantly. But still, it is the #1 it's the most numerous group of students. So Chinese students are the main source of skill migration in the US. because the return rate for Chinese students in the US is the lowest that of other host countries. Upon graduation, the majority of them are recruited by US employers who sponsor their H-1B visas and then visa adjustment to permanent residency. So here is a figure showing H-1B visa issuance. Although China is a distant second to India, most of the H-1B visas granted to the Chinese were to former students studying in the US. US employers can directly recruit from India, but not from China. Lastly, I would like to say a few words about the impact of worsening US-China relations on immigration and integration. In the global competition for talent, the US had an upper hand. Chinese skill migration supplies the much needed labor in the US knowledge economy, making a significant contribution. It is a known fact that in any high-tech companies, industrial R&D labs, or research universities, the visibility of Chinese immigrants is simply remarkable. Our research has shown that circular flows of skilled migrants lead to triple win outcomes, benefiting not only the receiving country, but also the sending country as well as the immigrants themselves. I would add that circular skill migration also benefit diasporic community development through ethnic entrepreneurship and transnational engagement with China. Worsening US-China relations would make the US lose out in the global competition for foreign talent. In particular, it would negatively affect skill migration from China. Hostile context of reception in the US would discourage Chinese students to come here to study and to seek employment in the US upon graduation. However, the US would not lose to China, but lose to other countries in the global north, other developing countries. In other words, blocking Chinese students from coming to the US would not stop Chinese talent migration, as the Chinese would go somewhere else, such as Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. In other words, the loss and gain in the talent competition is not symmetrical for China. Worsening US-China relations would also negatively affect immigrant integration for Chinese immigrants and their native-born children, and for other Asian Americans for that matter. Worsening bilateral relations would create new hardships, putting immigrants and those holding H-1Bs in a state of precariousness, such as unemployment insecurity, labor exploitation, and resettlement uncertainty. This is a situation more commonly experienced in receiving countries of restrictive immigration policies, and now in the US as well. Worsening bilateral relations would also create barriers for immigrant integration, even among those of higher socioeconomic status. Our research has shown that Asian immigrants are stereotyped as good scientists or good engineers with no leadership quality. And as a result, they have continued to face the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling in the labor market. They are US-born or US-raised children speaking perfect English, effortlessly adopting the mainstream American cultural values, and even marrying members of the dominant group, are also stereotyped as simultaneously the model minority and the forever or perpetual foreigner. They still have to constantly prove that they are truly loyal Americans, especially in times when US-China relations are sour. At the present moment, they are vulnerable of being accused of stealing trade secrets and technology for China and treated as suspects of spying for China. Last but not least, worsening US-China relations are also detrimental to diasporic development. On the one hand, transnational engagement with China as an effective path to integration would be blocked. On the other hand, Chinese immigrants would be forced in a situation where they are excluded again from the American nation, whether they are naturalized citizens or citizens by birth. I would end on a positive note for future Chinese America. That is, this land is our land. Adversity has already resulted in greater ethnic consciousness and a sense of urgency to unite to fight back. Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans have already been politically more active than ever before. For us, China is our ancestral homeland, and the US is our new homeland. We should constantly fight for our own civil rights in this land. And we should also be politically mobilized to work together to improve the US-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists for these very thought-provoking presentations. We do have quite a few questions, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. But I'll start here. Okay, we do have our first question is for Professor Lok Soo. You spoke about the ideology of yellow peril. Is it in the context of USA only?
Unmute. No, in fact, much of the yellow peril discourse is a globalized one. So you're talking about the circulation of images and discourses that have been around for over 100+ years, you know, and this is emanating from Europe as well as from the US and Canada and other places. I work in Latin America. And much of my research is in Latin America, and I see those also replicated throughout Latin America. So it is a globalized discourse and images. And in fact, the Fu Manchu character emerges. Sax Rohmer is actually a British writer. So just to give you a sense, even though a lot of the films are based in Hollywood, that's coming out of around that character, and as well as sort of follow-up characters, the afterlife, you know, of Fu Manchu.
Thank you. And there's another question for you and Professor Lee as well. The responses of Canada-US leadership towards the coronavirus has been vastly different. Do you think racism on the ground is directly influenced by these political responses?
Chris, you want to take that first and I'll follow up?
Sure. Yes. So I'm not going to comment on U.S. response to COVID. I think I'll let Locke take that up. But I think, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's positive to see certain politics leaders, you know, make certain statements around anti-Asian racism. Many of them came incredibly late, and many of them did not necessarily back that up with necessarily systemic or institutional changes that would actually protect Chinese Canadian communities. So I want to be careful as to, you know, the extent of government intervention in this area, which I think is ramping up, you know, as this crisis continues on. I mean, but that said, I think, you know, the U.S. and Canada shares a lot of media markets. I think that this debates around the origins of COVID and the anti-Asian racism do not stop at the border by any stretch of the imagination. And I will say, you know, Canada does perhaps imagine itself, perhaps during the Trump era especially, as being a particularly liberal nation. And I think we have to be, frankly, very careful of that kind of self-imagination during this time. There are some things that Canada has been doing fairly well. But I would also say, compared to a lot of Asian nations, our response to COVID, you know, is still lacking in many areas.
So I would think, yes, in many ways, the leadership has a great deal, you know, in the U.S. context in the response that we've been receiving. I think it is not a coincidence that we see a correlation, you know, when early on, you know, when our President Trump was mentioning using, you know, cavalierly these racial slurs of the Chinese virus, the Kung flu, over and over again. I think what it does is it taps into the existing American psyche of anti-Chinese sentiments, xenophobia, And I think, you know, it has a great deal to do with his being in a leadership position and having this, you know, huge platform and amplifying it, you know, and legitimating this kind of denigrating sort of discourse. And that denigration is reflected when people are shouting these anti-Chinese words and slurs as they are actually exhibiting the violence, the aggression, the physical attacks, you know, against Chinese and Asian Americans in the U.S. And you know, it's no coincidence also that when President Trump was actually, when he actually was infected by the virus, there was an uptake once again, you know, against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, that we see that correlation where people are reacting and responding, you know, and it goes back to, I think, his lack of leadership to a large extent to sort of really bring together and unify the country and to fight against the virus, not against the people.
Thank you. This one isn't directed to anyone in particular, but how is the current anti-Asian violence different from and similar with the anti-Asian sentiment in the 1980s that was also primarily driven by the economic tensions between US and Asian countries?
I can address that a bit. So we know the Winston Chin story. So in the 1980s, it was U.S.-Japan relations, right? So the economic competition between the U.S. and Japan, and you know, Winston Chen was a victim of that hate crime, anti-Asian, you know, anti-Japanese hate crime. He was Chinese and he was mistaken as Japanese, and so in the I see a lot of parallel between the past, and even when you go from the yellow peril rhetoric up till now. So I would argue it's not just economic, but there is also the culture, the conflict of the ideological differences as well as the cultural differences. So the threat, the concern is not only economic, but also political. You know, at this present moment, the threat of Chinese taking over and you know, threatening the U.S. Leadership position on the global stage as well. So history tend to, unfortunately, repeat itself in strikingly similar way.
Thank you. And so this next question might be for you as well. There is a rising trend of students from Africa in particular that go or aspire to go to China for higher education. Why do you think this is? And does this represent a shift in perspectives on who is being considered an intellectual powerhouse across the globe?
Yes, I don't have time to address the other side of that US-China relations, that is China, because over the past few decades, China is very successful in its economic reform, and economic development is very rapid. And China indeed has been a global economic leader as well. At least, you know, they aspire to challenge the U.S. hegemony, both in geopolitics and in economy. And then one of the things that I would like to point out is that China, with its economic success, it also aggressively finds investment opportunities all over the world. So one of which is through the Belt and Road Initiative. So since 2013, when China implemented this global infrastructure development strategy, China has already spent $200 billion US. And then with 138 countries that are mostly located in the global south, that is mostly developing or underdeveloped countries, and Africa is a big part of it. So when you see a country is investing in another country, there the capital flow and people flow would be intersecting, and you would expect that migration from that country to the source country would result. So African migration to China is also part of that interrelationship. So after China entered the WTO, the migration from Africa to China skyrocketed. And then also one of the ways to build China-Africa relations is China offers a lot of scholarship to Africa, to help Africa to, the same way as the US tried to help offer scholarship for other international students, especially students from developing countries. And China in the 1980s and 1990s, a big beneficiary. So when, in other words, when there are intense inter-country connections, you would expect that there are people movement too. And then China is not a country of international migration. So China is facing the challenges of dealing with international migrants, students in particular. As I said, student migration is potential migrants, like international students. Wherever you go, they are potential students, whether you are in China, in Japan, Singapore, they find a way. But when China, they don't have the way of, a predictable path for the students to get jobs into the mainstream economy, then, the immigrants would be creative and innovatively finding other ways. And then, it would pose a challenge of managing and governing the migration stream for China.
Thank you very much. This next one is for Professor Lee, and it's coming from the Canadian context. So the question is, what do you think the impact of the Canadian Parliamentary Committee saying China's policies in Xinjiang amount to genocide against the Muslim minority?
Sorry, so what do I think of that particular?
I think the impact of the Canada's Parliamentary Committee saying that it is a potential.
I mean, I'm not an expert on that particular topic, but my sense is the impact right now is still remains to be seen. I mean, there is a parliamentary resolution around human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I don't believe that this has led to necessarily things like, economic measures. And so we haven't seen the kind of sanctions and things like that. And of course, that's going to be the question of where does this lead to? I do think more broadly, like we are in a moment where these questions are getting more media attention, more political attention. And this is sort of true, not just in the Xinjiang, but, Hong Kong and other issues of tensions within China and the Chinese speaking world. I'm not sure that in itself is new. I mean, when we think after '89, for example, very similar kinds of political pressures were placed on, Western governments to take stands on things. I do think that the balance of power is different. And that, of course, is going to lead to very different strategic calculations. I think we're seeing that in sort of all levels of government, how to make that strategic calculation. And that, I think, is probably the slightly difference in terms of balance.
Great, thank you. This next question is also for you. Can you tell us more about the recently opened Chinese-Canadian Museum in Vancouver and the kind of work it's doing on Chinese-Canadian structural racism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a specific BC development recently, very exciting development. The museum itself hasn't opened. I mean, there's currently work towards that, but there is an inaugural exhibit just opened in Vancouver's Chinatown. I think that's it. What's important about a project like that is not just the importance of preserving this history, because I think one of the structural aspects of structural racism is that you forget important histories of Chinese presence in BC. But more locally, it's part of a broader commitment to preserving Chinatown as a historical district, for example, to being very worried and very intentional about the effects of gentrification in Chinatown, and how the erasure of history isn't just a kind of theoretical thing, but actually has very clear impacts on communities on the ground. So I think in all that kind of way, in addition to education and programming, cultural work, there's lots of ways in which a cultural institution and facility can make really important interventions in structural racism.
That's great. This next one is open for anyone to answer. How are Chinese language press and the immigrant generation interpreting the US elections and anti-Chinese discriminatory incidents in the US and Canada?
Let me take this on a bit. I have studied the impact of the role of Chinese language media on the adaptation and integration of Chinese immigrants. And my conclusion from my empirical study is that Chinese language media actually facilitate and help immigrants to adapt to their new homeland. So that's a conclusion. Why? Because new immigrants, when they are coming to their new land, and they have language barriers, cultural barriers, and also their normal information channel is blocked. And then it is the Chinese language media that facilitate a lot of information, not only with the homeland, China, Taiwan, or Hong Kong, wherever they are from the Chinese-speaking world, but also the Chinese language media give a lot of information about the mainstream American society. So from there, even though they don't speak the English, they know what's going on in America. So in that way, it plays a very important role in immigrant adaptation. But then currently, I haven't studied that phenomenon over the past 10 years. And I just read an article saying that, in Foreign Affairs, the title is China's Threat to American Democracy. So he's accusing China, he's claiming that all Chinese language media in North America has mainland Chinese influence. Well, I don't know whether there is any truth to it, but the Chinese language media, they also offer a platform for people to express their views. Whether there is any Chinese influence and censorship, they may have, but I don't know. In any case, I tend to look at things more positively. I feel that this is a free land. Freedom of speech is at the heart of democracy, and Chinese Americans and Chinese, Chinese immigrants here, they are not passive about their own fate. They are active, and they are utilizing democracy and also freedom of speech to express their view. So in the Chinese language media, I would say that it also reflects the view. It's the same as the mainstream U.S. media, right? It expressed the view of the community, so to speak.
Does anyone, Lokta, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to take it to a little bit of a tangent off, but similar, the question of how the Chinese diaspora, is reacting to this, especially in relationship to the upcoming elections and the conservative liberal fault lines. I just came from a talk just before this, and these are new data that has been generated around youth, actually, around the youth group between, I think, the ages of 18 to about 35. And they have found that over 70% of people are saying that the response to COVID-19 is really a determining factor in their voting. So, as part of the Chinese diaspora, we have this increasing youth population that is coming of age, that will be voting and that will be speaking very loudly, against the various issues for COVID-19, but all kinds of progressive issues, that are going forward, that are at stake in this election. So I just wanted to bring that up too.
Thank you. Our next question is, how does the international geopolitical turn from globalization towards nationalism, including both the US and China, affect first generation and recent immigrants, Chinese in the US? And how does the identifying with seemingly competing ideologies contribute to inner as well as interpersonal conflict among this population?
Let me take this on again. Right. As I said, US-China relations are very much affecting the Chinese American life or Asian American life here on this land. So that's why, you know, myself, an immigrant turned Chinese American, and I would like to see positive US-China relations, because that would benefit both countries as well as peoples and also, you know, communities, right? So because the Chinese community itself, or Chinese American community in particular, is very diverse. It's not like one people. They are coming from different places of origin, and they have different experiences both with their homeland politics and with the US politics. And they are also from different social class and you know, have different lived experience on this land as well. So we won't expect them to be like African Americans that are overwhelmingly voting for you know, for Democrats. So Chinese Americans are quite diverse on that. But I kind of, you know, now because, you know, the election and also US-China relations kind of awakened the political consciousness of the Chinese community, whether they are neoconservative, nationalists, or progressive. You know, they take advantage of democracy, and they are not shy in speaking out their own view. So for that, I think, you know, the development is positive. But of course, at the personal level, you know, we know that even amongst my my circle, right, in the election year, even in my very close friendship circle, there are certain things that we try to avoid talking, because once you talk, then you become kind of enemies. And then even when you talk about nationalism, right? Are you nationalistic as Chinese or nationalistic as American? Right. So we are kind of put in this awkward situation that we are forced to make choices when we should not need to.
Yes, yeah, please.
Yeah, if I want to just jump in for a minute, I think there is a very clear shift in terms of the globalization discourse, you know, that is exhibited in, you know, in just the media, you know, in popular discourse, but also in our policies, to, you know, really more recently, the isolationist stand that the US has taken to a large extent. I don't think it's so much that there is a decrease of competition, but in fact, you know, the competition has always been there, but it's really about what animates the sort of engagement. You know, is it an engagement of, okay, let's negotiate, let's collaborate, let's cooperate? Or, you know, is it more of, you know what, you are our enemy number one, which is in many ways, you know, what our country has done, you know, through the Trump administration, and we don't want anything, you know, to deal with you, and we're going to be very harsh on you, etc. So I think there are these different impetus and impulse, you know, that's driving the kind of conditions, the social conditions and the political conditions that we're in. And it's very much, you know, what is sort of all around us, you know, affecting the way that we're engaging with issues of, you know, Chinese American, Asian American sort of well-being and politics, and how, you know, the Chinese diaspora is actually kind of put in the spotlight, you know, to have to deal and grapple with these very challenging circumstances that are not of our making. that is not of our making, but it's actually on a much more sort of geopolitical struggle here that's going on.
Yeah, can I just add, I mean, that generation question is so interesting because as events are happening in Asia or maybe in the US and China, and Canadians are kind of looking at it a bit of the side, it's been very interesting to think about how this lands on generation, and especially depending on the background of immigrants or immigrant families. So like, for example, last year, there were lots of cases of intergenerational conflict around the Hong Kong protests, between, and which is ironic actually, because many of those families actually immigrated to Canada in the 1990s because of anxieties about the 1997 handover. But in fact, the families often divided, sometimes along generational lines, on whether to support or to condemn the protest. So I think that's where, background and generation had to come together in quite unexpected sorts of ways. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot more. These generational interpersonal relations becomes a mirror into all the complexity of the world that we're living in.
Thank you very much for that. The next one is, we've talked a lot about Chinese communities in Canada and the US, and that perhaps the existing and longstanding community structures, but they're wondering if there's any panelists that have insight on the community building in different spaces that don't have these existing structures. Does it happen online, and how does it start?
If my work on Chinese diaspora, primarily in Latin America, but there are probably very few countries that probably do not have an existing Chinese diaspora community, and that has to do with centuries long of migrations. And I think that it's not that whether they exist or not. It's really about what segments of the population find what kinds of institutions or technology platforms that are most engaging for them, that make the most difference. So I think there's a whole variety, and I think it now actually crosses generational lines as well. I think there are many more people who are older, who are sort of experts at WeChat and Facebook, who are Instagram users, and we can't assume that this is only a youth kind of phenomenon anymore. And the youth are also engaged in other kinds of activities, perhaps in TikTok, other technology platforms, but they're also creating their own organizations on the ground. So I think there's tremendous creativity and activity and energy that's going in, and we see that probably in every place where there are Chinese diasporic communities, which are in many cities all around the world.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Locke was saying, I mean, that activation of Chinese communities is, I think, especially interesting at a time of social media and more general connections around the world. I mean, my mom, who's incredibly active on WeChat, is now taken to sending me chats that she sees so I can do fact checking. and that's especially important during COVID. But actually, that was an issue that we talked about in certain community meetings, in fact, how to think about this information, on social media platforms, especially when a lot of elders are accessing that kind of information. I just also want to second what Locke says about the possibility of new community formations during this time. I think, COVID has definitely seen that in Vancouver as well as across Canada. And that really just sort of moves into much longer processes of anti-racism that have already been here, but this moment really is activating those as well.
Yeah, let me add to how this US-China relations affect diasporic formation. So when we talk about diasporas, it's a community that has a history of migration and also has the homeland and new homeland, right? So.
Uh-oh.
Oh, you're frozen. Let's see. Okay, maybe she'll come back to it. It looks like she's still there, but maybe it's just frozen. Oh,
she's now off.
Maybe she's dialing back.
Okay. I would like her to finish her thought. I don't know, did you guys want to move on to another question while we wait?
Yeah, why don't we do that, and hopefully she'll return to finish.
Here she is.
Oh, there she
There
is.
she is.
I'm sorry. That's the problem with modern technology. I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So I was talking about.
Oh. Oh.
I'm wondering if she had to come back in again. Let's see. Okay. Min, can you hear us? Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds. Looks like she might be trying to reconnect. Okay, there she is.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, please continue.
Yes. So here, in America, the Chinese community is very strong. Part of it is because of, people. There are a lot of tremendous human capital and also financial capital injected in the community. And some of the human capital and social capital building is through economic activities and through engagement with China. So when the two countries are at odds with one another, that would negatively affect the natural flow, right? So it would negatively affect the economic life, the ethnic economic life in the community. And then, in a way, I don't know, in a way it could push the diasporic community to transform into an ethnic community and to become more nationalist, nationalists as ethnic American rather than diasporic. As in Chinese, there is a word "qiao." So "qiao" means you are, straddle, you are transnational.
Thank you. I'd like to close with a question for all of you, and it's a question posed here in our Q&A. What suggestions do you have for Chinese scholars during this challenging time, as scholars yourselves?
Well, for me, I would like to both engage more with my own students, because students are my inspiration as always, and I enjoy my work because, I always have the youth with me, and it make me feel young also. And then also I would like to engage the community, and, as I direct the Asia Pacific Center, I'm trying to take, activities like that to the larger communities, not just the Chinese community, but the larger Los Angeles community in the local area as well, for more intellectual exchange and conversation with the community to enhance understanding and knowledge.
That's great.
Yeah, I would say, in terms of being a Chinese, like an ethnic Chinese or diasporic scholar, I think I've become very aware in the last couple of months about what it means to inhabit the university, as a space, and at least in North America, that we can assume is always responsive to the needs of Chinese and other Asian diasporic communities. What does it mean to be a bridge in that context as well? And especially during COVID, the amounts of work that folks at universities are doing in terms of supporting our students during really difficult times, but also in many cases supporting our communities during very difficult times. And I think in that sense, ethnic Chinese diasporic scholars have a big role to play. And that may not immediately be about our scholarship at the current moment, or maybe it may take years for us to think in terms of our scholarship what's happening right now. But I think all of us have contexts in which we can make daily decisions that impact the lives of our students and communities. And I'm looking for good ways of thinking about the responsibility during this time.
Yeah, I think I agree with Min and Chris, about the responsibility of Chinese diaspora scholars, but it actually is about scholars more generally that I'm thinking about. It shouldn't be just the responsibility of, Chinese American scholars, Chinese Canadian scholars, in the same way that we shouldn't be just, expecting our African American scholars to speak about issues of race. I think it's really the responsibility of the whole entire academic community to step up and really to consider, what it is, what is our role, as academics, as researchers, and to think really critically about what it means to be a public intellectual. And a public intellectual that is not just, hiding in our classrooms, although that has an important role to play for students, but it's really about being outspoken when the occasion presents itself, and such as just as at this time, I think that if we don't speak, we're complicit, to a certain kind of politics, and we must we have a certain responsibility, as people who have had the opportunities and time to think about these issues and knowledge, and to speak, to and to contribute to these debates and questions that really define our being, as Asian Americans, Chinese diaspora scholars, and scholars more generally.
Thank you so much. So I would like to pass on a big thank you to our presenters of today's webinar, Professor Lok Su, Professor Chris Lee, and Professor Min Zhao. And I'd like to extend a thank you to our partners, UCLA Asia Pacific Center, UC Berkeley Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program. And if you missed any of today's session, or you'd like to share this information with others, we will be making the recording available on our website, and we'll be sharing it with our partners as well. And for more information on the Zoryan Institute and its work, or to order your copy of the Chinese Diaspora, its development from global perspective, please visit our website at zoryaninstitute.org. And if you are placing an order of over 10 books, or if you buy a copy and donate a copy to an academic library, please contact the Institute directly and you will receive a special discount of 15%. So enjoy your weekend, stay safe, and thank you so much again to our presenters today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.